The silver ship descended toward Harmony Station with the grace of a dancer moving across a perfectly silent stage. Every movement was calculated. Every angle was exact. Every second of the approach had been planned months in advance, and now, as the vessel finally touched the docking cradle, it settled into place as if the metal beneath it was a soft pillow waiting to receive it. Commander Teo sat in the pilot seat, his long Velothian fingers resting gently on the control panels. His skin shimmered with a faint blue hue, a natural color that his people carried from their homeworld of Veloth Prime. His large eyes, black as the deepest space, reflected the glow of the docking indicators as the mechanical arms locked his ship into place. The entire approach had taken exactly 14 minutes and 32 seconds. Not a single deviation from the planned trajectory. Not a single error. The docking bay of Harmony Station was massive, easily large enough to hold dozens of ships like his. But today, all eyes were focused on his silver vessel. As the landing sequence completed and the connection lights turned green, alarms did not sound. There were no emergency warnings. There was no need for corrections or adjustments. Everything was perfect. Outside the station's thick windows, crowds of beings from 100 different worlds had gathered to watch. Some had eyes like compound lenses. Some had no eyes at all, instead using sensory organs that detected movement and heat. Some stood on 2 legs, some on 4, and some simply floated in the special anti-gravity zones that had been created throughout the station. But all of them watched in wonder. A Zelthian trader pushed his way to a better viewing spot, his purple skin rippling with excitement. Next to him, a group of Quantarians, mathematical beings who existed almost entirely to solve complex equations and problems, ran calculations on small devices they held in what might have been called hands. Their conclusion was unanimous. What they had just witnessed was technically perfect in every way. The docking doors slid open, and Commander Teo emerged. He was tall, taller than most beings, with a frame that seemed to be built for precision and control. His flight suit was pristine white, decorated with medals and ribbons that represented his achievements. He walked down the ramp slowly, allowing the gathered crowd to see him clearly. This was his moment, and he understood the importance of making an entrance. The applause began slowly but quickly grew into a roar. Alien voices made sounds that no human ear had ever heard before. Some were musical, some were like the rumbling of distant thunder, and some were simply electronic beeps and whistles, translated by the station's universal communication system. But all expressed the same emotion: admiration. Standing near the back of the observation window was Dr. Haywan. She was human, one of only a few humans on the station. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the Velothian commander accept the praise of the crowd. Her dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied his movements carefully. She had been a pilot herself, though not in space. She had flown combat jets for the Korean Space Force, back when humans had not yet made their first contact with the larger galactic community. Kite stood beside her, also human. He was smaller than Haiwan, with quick movements and quicker thinking. He had been an engineer for the Earth Space Force, and now he worked as an advisor at the diplomatic summit. He nudged Haiwan gently with his elbow. "That was impressive," Kite said, his voice carrying the tones of someone who respected skill, even in others. "It was perfect," Haiwan replied. "Too perfect." Kite turned to look at her. "What do you mean, too perfect?" "Perfection like that comes from following a formula exactly," she said, still watching the Velothian commander shake hands with various dignitaries. "It is beautiful to watch, but it is not adaptive. It is not creative. It is simply perfect execution of a planned route." In the grand hall of the station, the evening celebration was already beginning. Long tables had been set up with foods from dozens of worlds. Some items were solid, some were liquid, and some seemed to exist in states of matter that human science had not yet fully explained. Musicians from different species played instruments that created music ranging from the hauntingly beautiful to the almost unbearably loud. Commander Teo stood at the center of the main hall, surrounded by admirers. Delegates from the wealthy trading nations wanted to know if he could transport their cargo. Military commanders asked if he would consider training their pilots. Scientists wanted to study his brain, curious about what made a mind capable of such precision. The Velothian commander accepted all the compliments with calm dignity. He had heard them all before. He had won the Intergalactic Pilot Championship 3 times in a row. His record was unmatched. He had never missed a landing. He had never made an error that required correction. He was, quite simply, the best pilot in the galaxy. As the evening progressed, Teo began to speak more openly about his achievements. His voice was smooth and measured, like everything else about him. He talked about his training on Veloth Prime, about the advanced simulation systems that had prepared him for every possible scenario. He discussed the superiority of Velothian engineering and the physical advantages that his species possessed. "In all my years," Teo said to a gathering of listeners, "I have never seen a pilot from any other species achieve what I have achieved. Our bodies are designed for precision. Our minds are engineered for mathematics. There is simply no comparison." HFY, who had come to the celebration more out of diplomatic duty than genuine interest, found herself listening to these words. She stood near the edge of the crowd, holding a glass of water. Around her, other species nodded in agreement with the Velothian's assessment. The night grew later, and most of the crowd had begun to disperse to other areas of the station. Kite had left hours earlier, claiming to check on some equipment in the human quarters. Only a handful of beings remained near Commander Teo, still discussing his remarkable skills. It was at this moment that HFY decided to step forward. "Your landing was impressive," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to be heard. Commander Teo turned to look at her. His large black eyes studied her with mild curiosity. "You are human, yes? I have heard about your species. You have only recently joined the galactic community." "That is correct," HFY said. "I flew fighters for my military back on Earth. I am familiar with precision flying." The Velothian's expression did not change, but something like amusement seemed to flicker behind his eyes. "I am certain you are skilled by the standards of your people, but our worlds operate on very different levels of technology and capability." "Perhaps," HFY said. "Or perhaps different does not mean inferior." Around them, the remaining listeners grew quiet. They were hearing something unexpected, something that challenged the order of things as they understood it. A human, questioning the Velothian champion. It was either very brave or very foolish. "Are you suggesting," Teo asked slowly, "that a human pilot could match my performance?" "I am suggesting," HFY replied, "that perfection has many forms. And I am suggesting that you have never seen a human attempt what you just accomplished." Teo considered this for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not a cruel smile, but it was confident. "Very well. If you are so certain, then prove it. Replicate my landing. If you can match my performance, I will acknowledge that humans possess the skills I have credited only to my own people. If you fail, then you will acknowledge that there are some forms of excellence that remain beyond human capability." HFY did not hesitate. "Agreed." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge that had just been accepted. Neither one knew in that moment exactly what they had started. Neither one could have predicted what would happen when a human pilot and a Velothian champion came together in the sky above Harmony Station. The news of the challenge spread through Harmony Station like electricity through a wire. Within hours, Every being on the station had heard about it. The human diplomat had challenged the greatest pilot in the galaxy. It was the kind of thing that beings would talk about for decades, assuming the human did not fail too badly. In the human quarters, located in the section of the station designated for Earth diplomats, HFY sat with Kitai and went over the details of what she had done. Kitai looked at her with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "You really did it," he said, shaking his head. "You actually challenged the champion. Do you understand what you have started?" "I understand perfectly," HFY replied. She was sitting cross-legged on the small couch in their shared living space, her fingers moving quickly as she accessed information on the wall-mounted screen. "I have 4 hours before the challenge begins. I need to review every detail of the Velothian ship's systems, its weight distribution, its thruster response time, and everything else that will affect how it flies." Kitai sat down next to her, watching the data scroll across the screen. "HFY, you know that what you are planning to do is insane, right? Even if your skills are as good as I think they are, reversing into a docking bay is not something that has ever been done before, and it certainly has never been done successfully." HFY turned to look at him, and Kitai saw something in her eyes that he recognized from their years together. It was the look she had just before attempting something difficult. "Kitai, I have been practicing this maneuver on the simulator for the past 3 months. Do you remember? I told you I was working on something secret for the diplomatic summit." "I thought you were working on some kind of negotiation strategy," Kitai said. "Not a crazy flying stunt?" "It is both," HFY said with a small smile. "This is my negotiation strategy. These aliens need to understand that humans are not inferior. They need to see that we think differently, and sometimes thinking differently is stronger than following the same rules everyone else follows." Kitai looked at the wall screen, where the simulator data showed HFY's practice attempts. She had done the reverse landing 43 times in the simulation, and she had succeeded 38 times. Her failure rate was not 0, but it was low enough to suggest that she understood the maneuver well enough to attempt it in reality. "You are either the bravest person I have ever known," Kitai said, "or the most foolish, and I am not sure which one it is." "Perhaps I am both," HFY said. "Come with me. I need a co-pilot, and there is no one else on this station who understands Earth systems the way you do. I need someone I can trust." Kitai did not answer immediately. He thought about his job, about the risks, about what would happen if HFY failed. But he also thought about what would happen if she succeeded. And he thought about the look in her eyes. "All right," he said finally. "Let us do this crazy thing together." By the time the morning of the challenge arrived, Harmony Station had been completely transformed. News feeds from across the galaxy had picked up the story. Beings who had not been on the station had requested access to watch the event live. The space above and around the station was now filled with small observation ships, all holding beings who had come to witness either the triumph or the humiliation of a human pilot. The Quantarians had already run their analysis. They predicted a 93.7% chance of failure. The Zelthian traders were taking bets on whether the human would crash, and if so, how spectacularly. The only beings who seemed to have faith in HFY were the humans themselves, and even some of them were not entirely sure this was a good idea. Teo stood in the docking bay area, watching as a second ship was brought in. It was identical to the one he had landed so perfectly the day before. The ship was called a Class 5 transport, a large and heavy vessel that was not designed for acrobatic maneuvers. It was designed to land safely and efficiently, nothing more. The idea of reversing one into a docking bay seemed to violate every principle of ship design. The Velothian commander showed no signs of concern. If anything, he seemed amused. He had offered this challenge confident that no human would be insane enough to accept it, or if they did accept, they would be wise enough not to follow through. But here was HFY, climbing into the pilot seat of the identical ship, with Kite strapping into the co-pilot position beside her. The flight control room was crowded with operators from a dozen different species. Their job was to monitor the attempt and to be ready to activate emergency measures if things went wrong. They had already discussed what would happen in various failure scenarios. Most of those scenarios involved the ship crashing into the docking bay at high speed. HFY ran through the pre-flight checklist with Kite, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. She checked the thruster systems, verified the fuel levels, confirmed that all the navigation systems were responding correctly. Everything was working perfectly. Commander Teo watched from the observation window. He saw the careful way HFY was preparing for the flight. It reminded him of his own preparation. Perhaps this human was not as foolish as he had thought. Perhaps she simply did not understand the difference between confidence and delusion. The time came for the ship to launch. HFY looked over at Kite, and he nodded. She closed her eyes for just a moment, taking a deep breath. Then she opened them again and began the launch sequence. The ship lifted away from the docking bay smoothly. It rose through the atmosphere and into space, moving away from Harmony Station until it reached the point where Tayo had launched from the day before. The distance was exactly the same. The angle of approach would be exactly the same, but everything else would be completely different. HFY positioned the ship and checked all her systems one more time. She could feel Kite's eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do next. "Here we go," she said quietly. And then, to the shock of every being watching, she began to rotate the ship backward. The nose of the vessel, which had been pointing toward the station, now pointed away. The tail, which had been pointing back toward space, now pointed toward the docking bay. In the flight control room, alarms began to sound. This was not a normal approach. This was not even close to normal. The operators looked at each other in confusion. Was the human ship in trouble? Had something malfunctioned? Teo, watching from the observation window, felt something unusual. It was not quite surprise, but it was close. The human was actually attempting the impossible. HFY engaged the reverse thrusters. The ship began to move backward, its tail leading the way as it approached Harmony Station. The manual controls were responsive, but they required constant attention. Unlike Teo's forward approach, which could be largely automated with small adjustments from the pilot, this backward approach required HFY to fly every second of it herself. Kite called out the distance markers as they approached. 200 meters, 150, 100, 50 meters. The ship continued to move backward, guided by HFY's hands and her instincts. She could feel the ship through the controls, understanding its movements as if it were an extension of her own body. This was not precision in the way Tayo understood it. This was something else. This was adaptation, reaction, and trust in one's own abilities. 25 meters, Kite said, his voice steady. 15 meters. The docking bay was visible now, getting closer with each passing second. The opening where the ship was supposed to land seemed impossibly small, and the ship was approaching it backward, moving through space in a way that no safety manual had ever recommended. 5 meters, Kite said. 3 meters. HFY made final adjustments to the trajectory. The ship's tail section aligned perfectly with the docking cradle. She reduced the thruster power, and the ship came to a gentle stop just as the docking mechanisms engaged. The connection was perfect. The ship was docked backward, exactly where it needed to be. For a moment, there was complete silence throughout the entire station. No one was entirely sure what they had just witnessed. Then, as if someone had thrown a switch, the entire station erupted into chaos. Not panic, but wonder. The morning sun of the nearby star Kepler 7 had not yet reached the observation decks where most of the station's population had gathered. The news had spread during the night, while most beings were sleeping in their quarters or conducting private business. But by the time the first light of the day touched the station's windows, everyone knew what was about to happen. A new ship had arrived during the night, brought in on a transport vessel specifically for the challenge. It was identical to the ship that Teo had landed so perfectly, and identical to the ship that HFY would attempt to land in reverse. The three ships would be the variables in a simple test: precision against innovation, tradition against adaptation. In the flight control room, preparations were being made for the most closely watched event in the station's history. Every monitoring system had been triple-checked. Every emergency protocol had been reviewed and updated. Beings from the station's administration had gathered to ensure that the challenge would be conducted fairly and safely, or at least as safely as any insane stunt like this could possibly be. HFY was in the preparation room adjacent to the docking bay, going through a detailed physical examination. Station doctors from 3 different species wanted to make sure that she was healthy enough to handle the stress of what she was about to attempt. One doctor, a Quantarian with appendages that looked like tentacles, kept asking if she understood the risks. "I understand the risks," HFY said patiently. She was sitting on the medical examination table, waiting for them to finish their tests. "I have understood the risks since I accepted the challenge. The psychological stress alone could cause your performance to degrade," the Quantarian doctor said. "Human brains are known to experience something called performance anxiety. This could affect your reaction time and your judgment." "My brain has been trained to handle stress," HFY replied. "I have flown combat missions for my military. I have trained for situations where small mistakes can be fatal. This is difficult, yes, but I have faced difficult things before." Kitai sat in a corner of the room, watching the medical examination. He had already been examined and cleared for duty. As the co-pilot, his job would be to monitor the ship's systems and call out the vital information that HFY would need to complete the maneuver successfully. It was a crucial role, perhaps even more important than HFY's piloting skills. By the time the medical examination was complete, a crowd had already begun to gather at the observation windows. Word had spread through every sector of the station. This was not just a challenge between 2 pilots anymore. This had become something much larger. It had become a test of what was possible, a question about whether the rules of the galaxy were absolute or flexible. Teo arrived at the observation windows just as HFY and Kite made their way toward the docking bay where the new ship was waiting. The Velothian commander watched them walk past. He did not smile, but something in his expression seemed different from the day before. Perhaps he had begun to understand that what was about to happen might not go the way he had expected. In the docking bay, the ship sat waiting. It was larger than it looked in pictures and holograms, HFY thought. The metal hull shimmered under the station's lights, reflecting images of the beings who had gathered to watch. This ship had never been flown before. Its systems had been tested in simulation, but no living pilot had ever actually flown it. HFY would be the first. Kite ran his hands over the control panels as they entered the cockpit. He checked each system methodically, confirming that everything was functioning correctly. He had spent hours studying the technical specifications of this ship, learning its quirks and characteristics. He wanted to know everything about how it would respond to HFY's commands. "All systems are nominal," Kite said finally. "The ship is ready for flight." HFY settled into the pilot's seat and ran her hands across the controls. They were similar to the ship she had practiced with, but not identical. There were small differences in the layout, minor variations in how the controls responded. She would need to adjust to these differences during the flight. It was not ideal, but it was the reality of the situation. Through the window of the cockpit, she could see the observation areas filling with beings. Aliens from dozens of worlds had come to watch. Some had brought recording devices and broadcast equipment. This event would be transmitted across the galaxy, shared with billions of beings who could not be present in person. The pressure of that knowledge sat heavy on Hei-Wan's shoulders. She looked at Kite. "Are you ready?" "I have been ready since yesterday," Kite replied with a slight smile. "Let us show them what humans can do." Hei-Wan began the launch sequence. The engines hummed to life and the ship lifted smoothly off the docking platform. It rose through the docking bay, passed through the atmospheric seals, and emerged into the vacuum of space. The stars surrounded the ship on all sides, an ocean of light in an infinite darkness. As the ship climbed higher, moving away from the station, Hei-Wan adjusted the orientation of the vessel. She was not heading directly away from the station as Teo had done. Instead, she was plotting a more complex course, one that would position her for the maneuver she had planned. The Quantarians in the flight control room watched the ship's trajectory with their analytical minds working at maximum capacity. Their calculations showed that Hei-Wan was doing something unexpected. She was not approaching from the optimal angle. She was approaching at an angle that was more difficult, that would require more precise control of the ship's movement. "Why is she approaching from that trajectory?" one Quantarian asked another. The second Quantarian ran the calculations again. "The approach angle increases the difficulty of the maneuver by approximately 42%. I do not understand why she would make the task more difficult for herself." But Hei-Wan understood. She had planned this carefully in the simulator. By approaching from this angle, she could demonstrate something that Teo's perfect landing had not shown: the ability to adapt, to find new solutions, to think creatively about problems that others might consider solved. The ship continued to climb, moving away from Harmony Station. Hei-Wan watched the readouts on her console, keeping track of their distance and velocity. She was moving at the precise speed that she had calculated in the simulator. Everything was following the plan. "Distance to station, 500 kilometers, Kite called out, reading from the navigation display. The ship climbed higher, the station growing smaller behind them. The observation windows on the station showed the departing vessel, now just a point of light against the darkness of space. In the flight control room, the operators prepared themselves. They knew what was coming. The human pilot was going to attempt her maneuver. They did not know if she would succeed or fail, but they were ready for either outcome. Hei-Wan checked her instruments one final time. The ship was performing exactly as she had predicted it would. The engines were responsive, the thrusters were functioning perfectly, and the navigation systems were accurate to the smallest measurement. "All systems are go," she said quietly. "Beginning the approach sequence." The ship began to turn. Slowly, carefully, Hei-Wan rotated the vessel until it was aligned with the docking bay. The nose of the ship, which had been pointing into space, was now pointing away from the station. The tail was pointing toward the approaching maneuver. This was the moment. This was the point where either her training and preparation would pay off, or where the laws of physics would demonstrate why no one had ever attempted such a thing before. "Engaging reverse thrusters," Hei-Wan said. And then the ship began to move backward toward the station, and everything that Hei-Wan had planned would either succeed or fail in the next few minutes. The ship moved backward through space like a dancer executing a move they had practiced thousands of times. The reverse thrusters fired in precise bursts, each one calculated to move the vessel forward along its backward trajectory. It was a paradox that would have confused ordinary beings, but it made perfect sense to anyone who understood physics. Direction and orientation were not the same thing. A ship could be moving in one direction while facing another. Hei-Wan's hands were steady on the controls. She was not using the automated systems that would have made the landing simpler. She was flying manually, which meant that every decision, every adjustment, every slight correction came directly from her mind through her hands and into the ship's response systems. It was more difficult, but it was also more flexible. If something unexpected happened, her human instincts could adapt faster than any computer program could calculate. Kaite watched the distance markers counting down on his console. He had practiced this as many times as HFY had, learning the distances and timing so perfectly that he could call them out without thinking. 500 kilometers distance, Kaite said, his voice calm and steady. Approach velocity optimal. All systems functioning normally. In the observation areas of Harmony Station, the crowds pressed against the windows, trying to get a better view of the approaching ship. The monitors showed the vessel as a small dot of light, growing slowly larger as it moved backward toward them. It looked wrong somehow, moving in this direction. It looked like a violation of the natural order of things. The Zelthian traders, who had been taking bets since the challenge began, started calculating odds with rapid hand movements. A few of them were changing their bets. The early predictions of certain failure were beginning to shift. It was not confidence yet, but it was the beginning of doubt about whether this human would actually fail. Commander Teo stood perfectly still, watching the monitors with his large black eyes. Something was happening that he had not anticipated. The human was not panicking. The human was not making mistakes. The human was, impossibly, executing a difficult maneuver with a level of competence that surprised him. 400 kilometers, Kaite called out. Trajectory holding steady. HFY made a tiny adjustment to the right thruster. The ship responded immediately, shifting its angle by just a fraction of a degree. This was the part that computers struggled with, the constant tiny corrections that human pilots made without thinking. A computer would calculate the required correction and implement it all at once. A human pilot, using instinct and experience, could make thousands of small corrections, each one so minute that they seemed like natural aspects of the flight rather than conscious choices. In the flight control room, the operators had stopped their nervous chatter. They were watching in silence now, seeing something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. The human pilot was not just attempting the maneuver, she was executing it with competence. 300 kilometers, Kaite said. All systems still nominal. Thruster response time excellent. The ship continued to approach the station. From the perspective of someone standing on the station, it looked like a reverse approach, which was exactly what it was. But from the perspective of the beings on the ship, it felt like any normal flight. The instruments showed distance and direction and velocity, measurements that made sense in the context of a backward approach. HFY's concentration was absolute. She was not thinking about the gallery of aliens watching her, not thinking about the historical significance of what she was attempting, not thinking about what would happen if she failed. She was only thinking about the next adjustment, the next correction, the next small movement of her hands on the controls. 200 kilometers, Kaite said. Velocity still optimal, alignment still perfect. The ship's tail section, which would be the first part to enter the docking bay, began to glow slightly as the reverse thrusters pushed it faster. HFY was accelerating now, moving from a cautious approach to a speed that would allow her to complete the maneuver while maintaining the precision that it required. In the observation areas, some beings began to talk quietly with each other. Was this going to work? Was the human actually going to succeed? The early confidence in failure had begun to crack, replaced by something that looked like genuine possibility. 100 kilometers, Kaite said. Half the distance covered. Preparing for final approach sequence. HFY adjusted the angle of approach slightly. The docking bay opening was now visible, growing larger with each passing second. It looked impossibly small from this angle, impossibly narrow. But she had calculated this many times. She knew that if she maintained her current trajectory, if she did not make any large mistakes, the ship would fit through that opening. 50 kilometers, Kaite called out, entering final approach zone. The ship was moving faster now, but still under control. The thrusters were functioning perfectly. The navigation systems were tracking everything with precision. All the instruments were showing exactly what they should show. Heywan's heart was beating fast, but her hands were steady. This was the moment when everything would be decided. This was the point where either her years of training would pay off, or where the laws of physics would demonstrate their power over human ambition. 25 kilometers, Kaite said. Alignment perfect. Velocity holding steady at optimal approach speed. The docking bay opening filled the forward viewport now. To the observers in the station, the backward approaching ship looked like it was heading directly into a wall. The mathematics that would prove it was not seemed impossible to grasp. But the ship continued to move backward, approaching the opening with mathematical precision. 15 kilometers, Kaite said. 10 kilometers. Prepare for final alignment. Heywan made her final major adjustment, rotating the ship just slightly to ensure perfect alignment with the docking cradle. If she was off by even a small amount, the ship might clip the edge of the docking bay entrance. That would be enough to cause problems, enough to turn success into failure. But her calculations were correct. Her hands had guided the ship exactly where it needed to be. 5 kilometers, Kaite said, his voice beginning to show emotion. 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers. The docking bay entrance was enormous now, filling the entire forward viewport. The opening was like a mouth waiting to receive the backward approaching ship. 1 kilometer, Kaite said. 500 meters, 100 meters. Heywan cut the approach velocity by half, using careful thruster adjustments to slow the ship. They were close now, very close. The final meter and a half would determine everything. 50 meters, Kaite said. 30 meters, 20 meters. The tail section of the ship entered the docking bay opening. The walls of the bay seemed to pass by on either side of the viewport. For a moment, Heywan could see nothing but the interior walls of the docking bay. It was like entering a tunnel, and any mistake now would be catastrophic. 10 meters, Kaite said. 5 meters, 3 meters. Heywan made the final micro-adjustments, using the smallest possible thruster corrections to ensure perfect alignment. The docking bay mechanisms reached out, ready to engage and lock the ship into place. 1 meter, Kaite said, preparing for docking engagement. And then, with a gentle touch of metal on metal, the ship came to a perfect stop. The docking mechanisms engaged with a soft click. The connection lights turned green. The ship was docked backward, exactly where it needed to be, and the entire maneuver had been executed with perfect precision. For a moment, neither Heywan nor Kaite spoke. They simply sat in the quiet cockpit, taking in the reality of what they had just accomplished. Then Kaite let out a laugh that seemed to contain all the tension and stress of the past 24 hours. "We did it," he said simply. "We actually did it." Heywan allowed herself a small smile, but she was already thinking about what came next, about what this meant, about how the galaxy would respond to what they had just proven was possible. The silence on Harmony Station lasted only for a few seconds. Then it broke like ice beneath a heavy weight. The human section of the observation deck erupted first. The few dozen humans who had gathered to watch their fellow human attempt something impossible began to cheer and shout. Their voices carried the emotion of people who had believed in something that everyone else had told them was foolish. They had been right. They had trusted in one of their own, and that trust had been rewarded. The cheering spread. A Zelthian trader who had changed his bets to favor the human raised his arms in celebration, knowing that he had just won a substantial amount of currency. Groups of other beings began to applaud, using various appendages to create sounds that ranged from gentle clapping to something that sounded like distant thunder. But in the observation area where Commander Teo stood, the reaction was different. The Velothian champion remained perfectly still, watching the monitors that showed the successfully docked ship. His large black eyes showed no emotion. His face was as composed as it had been when he had completed his own perfect landing, yet something inside him was different. He had spent his entire life believing that there was only one way to achieve perfection. There was the way that Velothian training had taught him, the way of precise calculation and perfect execution of predetermined plans. But what he had just witnessed was something else. The human had achieved perfection through improvisation, through adaptation, through something that Velothian science would have considered impossible. Haywan and Kite emerged from the docking bay to find themselves surrounded by humans and aliens alike. Everyone wanted to talk to them, to ask questions, to understand how they had accomplished what they had just accomplished. The humans embraced them. The aliens studied them with expressions of genuine curiosity. A Quantarian approached them with one of the calculation devices in hand. "I have run the numbers 12,000 times," the Quantarian said. "In all the simulations based on the available data, the probability of success was no higher than 76%. Yet you succeeded. How did you account for the 17% probability of failure?" Haywan thought about how to answer this question. "I did not account for it," she said finally. "I simply trained until I felt that I understood the maneuver well enough to succeed. I trusted in my preparation and my ability to adapt if something unexpected happened." The Quantarian seemed to have difficulty processing this answer. "You performed an action with a 17% probability of failure? You deliberately accepted a significant chance of catastrophic failure?" "Yes," Haywan said. "That is what humans do sometimes. We take risks when we believe that the reward is worth the danger." In the diplomatic hall, word had spread even faster. The entire station seemed to be talking about nothing else. The impossible had become real. A human had done something that the greatest pilot in the galaxy said was impossible. The implications were staggering. By evening, Haywan was invited to a formal reception in the diplomatic hall. She wore the dress uniform of the Korean Space Force, a formal blue suit with medals representing her years of service. Kite stood beside her in his dress uniform as well. Together, they walked through corridors filled with beings from 100 different worlds, all of whom wanted to acknowledge what they had accomplished. Commander Teo was waiting for them in the diplomatic hall. He stood alone, apart from the crowds of celebrating beings. When Haywan saw him, she understood that this moment was important. This was not just about the triumph or failure of a stunt. This was about something much larger. She walked toward him, leaving Kite and the crowds behind. When she was close enough to speak without shouting over the noise of the celebration, she stopped. "Your landing was beautiful," Haywan said. "It was perfect in every way that precision can be perfect." Teo looked at her for a long moment before responding. "I watched what you did," he said slowly. "I do not understand it. I do not understand how you calculated the approach angle. I do not understand how you maintained control during the final descent. I do not understand how you achieved something that our mathematical models said was impossible." "Because I did not use calculation," Haywan said. "I used practice and instinct and trust in myself. I trained until my body understood the maneuver, not just my mind." The Velothian commander was quiet for a moment. "On Veloth Prime, we have believed for thousands of years that perfection comes from precision, that perfection comes from planning everything down to the smallest detail, from removing all uncertainty. You have shown me something different." "I am not saying that precision is wrong," Haywan said. "Your landing was magnificent. What I am saying is that there is more than one path to perfection. There are more ways of achieving excellence than just one way." Teo extended his hand to Haywan in the gesture of respect that his people used. "I underestimated you and your people. I believed that what I had achieved was the highest form of excellence possible. You have proven that I was wrong." Haywan reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm and steady, the grip of someone who had spent a lifetime controlling machines with perfect precision. "I have a question for you," Teo said. "Why did you accept my challenge? Why did you risk everything to prove a point about human capability?" HFY considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I believed that it was important for the galaxy to understand that there are many different ways of being excellent. We are not worse than other species because we are different. We are just different, and sometimes being different is exactly what is needed." The conversation ended, and HFY returned to the celebration. But throughout the rest of the evening, she noticed that Teo remained in the hall, watching and listening to the conversations around him. He was thinking about what HFY had said. He was processing the implications of what he had witnessed. Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the crowds had dispersed to various areas of the station, HFY found herself alone in one of the observation areas. She looked out at the stars, thinking about Earth, about her family, about how far humans had come in such a short time. Kite found her there and stood beside her in silence for a moment. "Do you think anything will change?" Kite asked. "Do you think that what you did will actually change how other species see humans?" "I think it has already started to change," HFY said. "But change is slow. We will need to show them again and again that humans have value, that we bring different perspectives and different capabilities to the galaxy. Today was just the beginning." "That is a lot of pressure," Kite said. "Being the person who showed the galaxy what humans could do." "It is," HFY agreed. "But it is also an honor. And besides, I did not do this alone. You were with me every step of the way. We did this together, as humans." Outside the observation window, the stars continued to shine. The galaxy continued to rotate on its ancient axis. And somewhere on Harmony Station, an alien species was having conversations about humans, about possibility, about everything they had believed that was now open to question. The impossible had become possible, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be quite the same.